everyone on behalf of the Culinary Historians of Canada to our ongoing series, Behind Every Great Cook is a Great Mother, hosted by Culinary Historian of Canada member John Ota. John is the author of the best-selling book, The Kitchen. So thank you, John, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Our guests today are Daphna Rabinovich, Simon Thibault, and Jennifer Cockrall-King. And Daphna's sitting in Toronto, Simon's in Halifax, and Jennifer's coming to us from the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. I want to stand up and sing "Oh Canada." We have people from all over Canada today. It's great. Our first guest is Daphna. And in the second half, and the third half, we'll have Simon and Jennifer. So Daphna Rabinovich, pastry chef, test kitchen director at Canadian Living Magazine, and freelance consultant, has loved cooking and baking for as long as she can remember. She's been in the food industry for over 25 years and co-hosted, along with Elizabeth Baird and Emily Richards, one of the first cooking shows in Canada. She won a Taste Canada Gold for the book Canadian Living Step by Step. Her latest book, The Baker and Me, was awarded the gold medal in 2016 by Taste Canada. Daphna, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm so delighted to be here.
Oh, it's great. Daphna, could you please tell us about your mom and the influence that she had on your cooking career?
Oh my gosh, where do I start? My mom was a great cook. She's still a good cook. She doesn't like cooking that much anymore because she's been doing it for so long. But my mom was a very, I would say, adventurous cook who was actually way ahead of her time. I mean, when I was growing up, maybe 6, 7, she was already making things like hummus and tahini and baba ganoush and things with pomegranate seeds and, you know, flame cooked aubergine, you know, eggplant. And she had a greengrocer. There was this farmer near where we lived, and he would come into town once a week in his little gray truck, gray green. And my mom would have him come to our house and she would pick fresh vegetables from it. And so she was eating and cooking local way before there was even that kind of expression. And she used to cook Greek food and Israeli food and Italian food, and way back before it was, I think, au courant.
And what was your childhood kitchen like?
Well, my childhood kitchen was actually this galley kitchen. It wasn't that big. You can see it right there on the screen with my young mother and my younger sister. And it wasn't actually very big, especially in relation to the house that we lived in. But my mother pumped out so much food in that kitchen. It was very efficient. And for instance, me and my 2 sisters, I'm the middle of 3 daughters, my mother would not let us eat sugar cereal when we were growing up. She didn't believe in it. So like no Frosted Flakes, no Cheerios, no nothing. So she would get up and she would make us incredible breakfasts, like things that you might have for lunch, because she wanted us to go off to school, you know, with a belly full, but didn't want us eating, you know, sugar-drenched cereals in the morning.
You know, I love in that photo how the spices are in that spice rack back there. I forgot about how people did that. And I think I got to do that in my kitchen again, because I've got them in the drawer and I can't find them. They're right there. If you're cooking, it's great when they're right there.
It is, but you don't want them too close. Like the drawer is actually a really good place because you don't want them near heat, right? Because it will degrade them. And especially if they're in glass bottles, you do want to keep them away from heat and away from light to sort of preserve their vigor.
Great advice. Thank you. So Daphna, I had the honor of sitting in on this incredible talk you gave on the history of bread and challah. And I realized that challah and bread is so much a part of your culture. So, and you're one of the great bakers in Canada. So what is it that motivates you to bake? Why do you bake?
Oh, I've been thinking about that since you asked it before we went on the Zoom meeting. And I have to say it is a visceral thing in my soul that I need to bake. It's not, I mean, I love, obviously, you know, the hands-on, the creativity behind it, but it really speaks to something very deep down in my soul, the creation of something. And yes, I mean, baking is a science, and you have to be somewhat recipe dependent, unlike cooking. But I think also when you get to a certain stage and you've baked a lot and you have the confidence and perhaps even the scientific know-how, you can really let your imagination and whimsy soar. And so I think that does something for me as well.
Yes, that's great. You know, it says here she still loves getting up on Sunday mornings to bake all manner of sweet goods for her husband and son.
I do. In fact, yesterday, I'll show you, did put it on Instagram, but I made a carrot cake loaf.
I saw that.
It's in the book with the cream icing, which both my husband and son don't like because they think it's too rich, but I really like.
I was eating my phone. So is there do you have any other thoughts about your mom and your kitchen? We've had these other photos up of these kitchen artifacts. The mixer, look at your mixer.
The mixer, right? So that was actually at our cottage until my older sister bought a new mixer for the cottage. And so I was able to take it because nobody else would take it. And I remember my mother baking with this. Also, my mother made, we did not grow up in a farm. I grew up in Ottawa and Montreal, but my mother canned a lot of stuff. And I remember her coming back from the market in the summer with flats and flats and flats of fresh strawberries. And she would make, oh my gosh, I would say 50 to 60 jars of, and she still does, of homemade strawberry jam, and she'd make blueberry jelly through the canonical sieve, so you get just the juice and none of the flesh. And I got this from her, which is a stemmer, the thing that you take stem off from the strawberries. And it would be a whole family affair. We would all sit down, me and my sisters, and we'd pick the stems off the strawberries, and she would make the jam through no recipe. My mom didn't really follow recipes. She just had a sense about her. So those are some of my extraordinary memories. You'll also see that I have these really old-fashioned cake and pie tins, and I will not give these up for anything. Because you cannot find these kind anymore, and they're fabulous.
You sent me a note about the color of a pie plate or of an appliance or a pan, and how important that is.
Well, this is a really old, in fact, it was my mother's aluminum cake pan, 8-inch square cake pan. And when you have something light like this, it actually reflects the heat. And so it makes for a more tender crumb. And so I actually cherish this beautiful cake pan, because now it's increasingly difficult to buy these. And what you get are dark non-stick pans, which actually don't treat the heat the same way. And so they influence your baking.
Oh my goodness, there you have it, Canada. Advice from Daphna. Fabulous. Thank you, Daphna. So Simon, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you again for having me. And also, it's kind of insane that I'm following Daphna, considering what Daphna did at Canadian Living influenced my own mother's cooking a lot. So this is a really kind of wonderful thing.
That's right. So I'm just going to read your bio here. Simon Thibault is a journalist, food writer, editor, and radio producer based out of Halifax. His work has been featured on CBC Radio, the Globe and Mail, the Huffington Post, the Southern Foodways podcast, and more. He's the author of Pantry and Palate, Remembering and Rediscovering Acadian Food. This is a beautiful book of Acadian recipes, memories, food photography, but most of all, I love the way the handwritten recipes in original handwriting are spread throughout the book. I'm just going to show you this. I don't know if you can see it, but this is, here we go. These handwritten recipes are spread throughout the book. And when I see handwritten recipes like this, Simon, I think it's like people never die. They're always with us when we're cooking.
I appreciate that immensely, because even though this is very much Mother's Day, there are very strong matrilineal lines like within my book, because it is a generational history of the women in my family, including my mother, but also women who preceded her. And so like, even this is right now, I'm at my desk, and sitting or on the wall next to me is my maternal grandmother in this photo, which is in the book. And so when I'm writing, I'm like surrounded by her and in other photos of family and things like that. And so I think it's important to continue those kind of matrilineal lines, and which I'm also very grateful to be in part of this, because and to be invited as a cisgendered white male to be asked to participate in a very feminine space. And so I just would like to thank Culinary Historians of Canada for thinking of me, and for Daphna and Jennifer for giving me space to kind of applaud them and other works of great women in food in Canada.
Oh, we applaud you. And I have to show you, I still have my green onion, my salted Acadian green onion pickle that you made for us at Canada's Table. I love it. I actually like it on Chinese and Japanese food. It's really good.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing little condiment. It's in the book. So
yeah, it's in the book.
Salted onion, it's a very common condiment.
Good. Can you please tell us about your mom and your childhood and growing up, and how she affected your culinary career?
It's funny because the book that I wrote was mostly about my grandmother, but when people were to ask me, and it's funny because when you initially asked me to be a part of this, I was like, what did my mom bring to me? Because it wasn't a huge narrative like the book, or most of the items that I have in my household would have been transmitted from my mother, but have been generational. But when I really think about the important thing of cooking, which is, for me especially, about transmitting appreciation and generosity and comfort and love of other people, and my mother did that so intrinsically in what she was doing, so I consider myself very lucky to have had that kind of relationship. And my mother taught by example in terms of how she did things, in which like at one point there was myself, my mother, my father, my sister, and my grandfather all in this house. And this is the 1980s, so this is like mid 80s, early 90s, so the heyday when Daphna would have been a Canadian living. So my mom actually was like, how do I keep these people entertained, and how do I not make cooking a form of drudgery? And she didn't. She kept it, she maintained it. But also, to speak back to what Daphne talked about, the whole idea of making things, my mother is of the first real major post-war generation in which the necessity of making preserves and goods and things like that wasn't necessary. You could purchase these things quite easily, even in parts of rural Canada, and yet my mother and father, and mostly my mother, chose specifically to make a lot of things like jams and salted onions and all kinds of things, because she viewed the value of those objects, and not just from an economic standpoint, but very much in terms of like agency and culinary and cultural preservation. And although she wouldn't use those words, that's exactly what she was doing.
So that's great. And that just leads me into the next question. So Simon, I've not been to our Canadian Acadia, and that will change once we get to travel again. But I have been to Lafayette, Louisiana, where the American Cajun people live. And there's an incredibly strong, deep commitment to Acadian culture there. And it's in the food, it's in the music, it's in the language, it's in the dance. So why do you think, after all these centuries, this a commitment to Acadian culture is so strong?
Excuse me. I would say that basically it's a response to being part of a diaspora. I think any group of individuals who are part of a diaspora, that dispersal creates a necessity for maintaining one's sense of identity, and that is often expressed the most immediately through food. And especially in places like in Louisiana, where Cajuns, unlike Acadians in what is now known as the Maritimes and the Atlantic provinces, we still were able to a certain degree maintain language. And so the isolation was linguistic, the isolation was cultural, the isolation was religious, but amongst Cajuns, even though they lost the language, a friend of mine once put it really beautifully. She said, Acadians express themselves by what comes out of their mouths, meaning their language, while Cajuns express themselves by what goes in their mouths. And I love that. And especially now, like now I feel like Acadians in Canada are learning from their Cajun cousins and seeing the value of this very humble, homey, subsistence form of cooking and elevating it, and not just in terms of like technique, but just in viewing the value of these things as being worth distributing and discussing.
So what do you think about this exchange between Louisiana and our maritime provinces?
The thing I love the most about it is that it's basically been going on for a very long time. I have, it's funny you bring it up. This is a photograph taken in 1930 of Cajuns coming from Louisiana to the inauguration of Grand Pre in Nova Scotia. So this is the first time these Cajuns, and most Cajuns, had been back in Nova Scotia since the expulsion. And so this is in the 1930s, and this was actually fostered by my great-great-uncle. And so this idea of, because this is very much a question of family oftentimes, it's not just a question of dispersal from a cultural context, and it is, but Acadians and Cajuns call each other cousins, even if they're not. There's this really strong familial connection. And the idea that we can have family members who cook slightly differently, but we still feel this connection towards one another, which I think is really lovely and important. And it's happening in terms of like, I know people living in rural Nova Scotia who now have gumbo nights. And I know people in Lafayette who make frico and all kinds of things like that, which is great.
So, and what does it mean to you to have written this book, just on a personal level?
I didn't expect the response that it got. I expected this book would be a little book that would speak to a very specific population of people in a very specific part of the country. And having people throughout North America respond to this book in this way has been not just amazing for me. That's great. Like as a writer, it's always good to see your stuff. But as an Acadian, having people contact me, like people in Los Angeles, people in Chicago, people in Vancouver, like all over the place telling me, hey, I made frico, hey, I made this, I made that. And how people within the Acadian community now come to me who have Acadian roots and are like, I love seeing the food that I grew up eating having a value outside of just my own home. So it's
great. Okay, thank you. Jennifer Cockrall-King, thank you for joining us today. Jennifer Cockrall-King is a Canadian writer and author based in Naramata in British Columbia's Okanagan Valley. For the past several years, Jennifer has been writing about urban issues such as food culture and urban agriculture. Her first book was Food and the City, Urban Agriculture and the New Food Revolution. Her second book is Food Artisans of the Okanagan, Your Guide to Locally Crafted Fare. It includes over 125 interviews with farm-to-table chefs, bakers, beekeepers, orchardists, farmers. It won the 2017 Taste Canada Gold Award for Culinary Narratives. Her latest book is Tawau. It won a World Gourmand Award. Jennifer's also working on a book about seed banks and seed savers around the world, tentatively titled Going to Seed, Racing to Save the World's Food Supply. And we'll watch out for that book. Thanks for joining us, Jennifer.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Great. Can you just tell us about your mom and how she influenced your cooking career and your writing career?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the story of my life, actually, because my mom and my dad loved food. And the dinner parties in the 70s and 80s were epic. And as kids, we were scurrying around and being shooed out of the room. But I mean, just the love of good food and getting people together and just sort of that hospitality atmosphere. Like when people come into your house, you just look after them, you feed them, you put on a celebration. You celebrate the fact that your friends are over, your family's over, and that's sort of a very strong line in our family. And even through this pandemic, we're celebrating thanks to technology, and we still get together virtually because it's just so much a part of us. And that's often the function of the females in the family. And my mom, gardener, epic gardener. Her garden at Lac Sainte Anne is legendary. And so when you garden and you grow food and you teach your kids how to grow food and you teach them what fresh food from the garden tastes like, as opposed to food that hasn't been, that's been picked underripe. And so we grew up with true flavors of food. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. And she's a great cook. She comes from, my grandmother was a terrible cook. And so my mom just sort of took a 90-degree turn and became a great cook. And there's a picture of Mom and I. We still just eat and drink together. And my dad passed away about 1.5 years ago. And he passed away in 2017. And about 1 year and some ago, Mom and I thought, let's go on a big trip and we're just going to eat. And she wanted to go to a big food event in Strasbourg, France. And she would have gone to it with my dad. And she just said, would you come with me? And I said, of course. And we just had 3.5 weeks. This is us in Venice, clearly having a terrible time.
Terrible time, yes. So could you please tell us about your latest book, To Wow?
Oh, sure. Here, I'm going to show you a little screenshot of it.
Beautiful.
So this is the first cookbook that it's my first cookbook and I co-authored it. They're my friend Shane Chartrand's recipes. He's Enoch from the Enoch Nation, just outside of Edmonton, on the west edge of Edmonton. And so he's a professional chef in Canada. He's a Red Seal chef, went to NATE, has been an executive chef at many restaurants for about 20 years. But when he was 29, he actually found out who his nation was, that he was Enoch, and because he was adopted. He was one of the 60 Scoop kids. And so he never really knew where he was from. He knew he was First Nations, but he didn't know which nation. He didn't know his family ties. And when he found that out about 12, 14 years ago, he began searching for his roots through food, and began working on basically a personal project of what is my food, what is an Indigenous chef in Canada right now, what is my food? And so it's very progressive, it's very worldly, and it's so interesting. And basically we worked for 5 years and created a cookbook.
Excellent. Thank you. So Jennifer, I have an architecture background, so I'm interested in cities and agriculture and food. What do you think that cities should be doing to make our food situation better?
Well, the silver lining perhaps of this pandemic is people are really taking another close look at food chains and what doesn't work very well in an industrial food system, and a long sort of stretched out food system where we're very disconnected from our producers. Sort of the meat situation in Canada is a prime example of, the frailty of having big meat producers or big slaughterhouses produce most of the meat. But what cities can do is provide space for people to grow food when it's such an impulse. It's almost as strong as baking sourdough as an impulse, is to start gardening. Everybody's gardening like mad right now. Seed companies can't keep up with orders to supply seeds, but everybody is just hunkering down and wanting to grow, like wanting a little bit of control. And it's not about providing your whole, calorie intake for your household. It's just about having a bit of control and doing something for yourself and enjoying the true flavors of food. I mean, to me, urban agriculture is just a culinary classroom. It teaches everybody what good food, what ripe food, what fresh food tastes like. And we've lost that if we don't have access to it. So cities can just let us grow. That's what they can do. And it's exciting. I mean, it's a mass movement that every time there's a crisis, we move back towards planting some of our own food. And, these are skills that once they're lost, they're lost. So I'm happy that, every once in a while, to keep the generational knowledge going, we have these impulses to teach our kids how to grow food.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what my parents did for me.
Yep.
And it was not glamorous. My mom was out weeding, with the mosquitoes and the black flies and all this stuff. It's not the image you see on book covers.
Great, thank you.
Right?
Julia, maybe it's time for Q&A right now. Are people asking questions?
Yes. Our first question is actually probably for each guest. We're wondering if you can tell us about particular comfort food dishes you had when you were a kid. Simon mentioned earlier comfort food. And so what were the particular items your mom or your dad cooked?
Carbohydrates. I kind of live for carbohydrates. The idea of comfort to me, actually, even though it is very much carbohydrates, is the idea of mostly around soup, actually. Real comfort comes in soup. My mom, it's so funny because I live in a household. I live by myself, but I have a house full of all kinds of things. But there are things I will never buy that my mother buys, and yet I will never be able to replicate the soups and things my mother makes because they're just very simple, but also well done. But they're also in techniques that I will never do. Like, I don't know. It's kind of funny. Like especially right now with COVID, so many people are dealing with like wanting processed foods in terms of comfort foods. But right now, my big thing has been soups, and like my mom would often make a very simple chicken and rice soup, or what she would call a soup à toutes sortes de choses, which would be a soup with all kinds of things in it. And so it's very much that. But no, but realistically, especially these days as an adult, comfort food is basically anything my mom makes for me. So.
Wow. And Daphna, what about you? What was comfort food for you?
Yeah, I agree with Simon. I mean, my mother, and she to this day makes extraordinary soups with just whatever is on hand. She just has this 6 soup sense. And when we were growing up, we had soup a lot for dinner, just soup and bread. And so that to me, and thick soups like potages, not necessarily clear soups, that were thick and full of beans and barley and all sorts of things and organ meats. So that was definitely something that we grew up and still to this day is a comfort for me. But also, she used to make I guess you would call it a pilaf today, although we used to call it a casserole of pititim, which is Israeli couscous, with like lots and lots of onions and lots of mushrooms in it. And to this day, like orzo or couscous is a real comfort food for me.
Great. Jennifer, what's comfort food for you?
It's garden produce. I have very strong memories of just sitting down at our outdoor dinner table at the cabin, shelling peas and eating peas out of the shell, just compulsively. And just, Mom would have these little recipes. She is a very adventurous cook. So in the dinner party heyday, they subscribed to these crazy books or programs where they would send people menus that would take 4 and 5 days to assemble. And so Mom would just be, trying new ways of preparing things. And she still does this and insists that every time we eat green beans, they have to be done this way. You caramelize some sugar in a Le Creuset pot, you pour some hot water onto it. It creates almost this crazy caramelized steam bath. You throw in the green beans and you just quick cook them so fast and you yank them out. And then she slivers some almonds and puts gobs of butter on, and they're crispy and delicious. And So things like that. So peas and beans, I mean, garden produce, that's the legacy of my mom. And our family makes a pretty mean sauerkraut. And it's actually my dad's great grandmother's. I wish I had the prop with me. We have the cabbage shredder from 3.5 generations ago, and it's dangerous. But we use it at the cabin and we shred 100 pounds of cabbage. And it was actually my mom who kept this tradition alive, even though it's my dad's side of the family. And I'm really grateful for that too.
Wow, thank you, Jennifer. And there's a question from Fiona about, so when did you move from Alberta to BC? And you mentioned, I think, Lac Sainte Anne, your mother's garden.
Yeah.
Is that in Quebec?
No, it's in Alberta. You know, anything north of Alberta is actually Franco-Alberta territory, and as well as Indigenous territory and Métis territory. So Lac Sainte Anne is just 45 minutes northwest of Edmonton, and it's where the family cabin is out there. So when did I move? That's a longer story than it should be. I came out here in 2005, part-time and full-time for the past 4 years.
Wow. Okay.
But I'm still a prairie girl. And I don't know if you could see me, I was scooting around trying to find a magazine. I wanted to, because the show and tell was fantastic and I'm woefully underprepared. So I wanted to show a picture of my mom at the cabin in a magazine I used to produce called the Edible Prairie Journal, but alas, I couldn't find it in time. Apologies.
Well, maybe you can post it on your social media later, and
Right.
we'll watch for that.
I will, yes.
That's great. Daphna, we have some questions about the other utensils in your photos.
Oh, sure. So one is, my mother loved, well, you know, we were a family of chocolate lovers, but my mom did love things with lemon. So I've got her very old reamer just to get the juice out with. I've already talked about the strawberry picker, if you will. My mother still has, and who was it? I think it was Dana the other day who showed you her cast iron pot that had been welded together. So I showed a Le Creuset pot because my mother has one of the original orange flame color Le Creuset pots, which I cannot tell you how many times has been welded together and made so many wonderful meals. And I can relate to what Jennifer said, because my mother was noted for her dinner parties, and this was later than Jennifer's parents, earlier rather. But, you know, again, spending days cooking things, baking things for these extravagant dinner parties that were for her bridge club, which I was lucky enough to help with. So that's what the Le Creuset was. And yes, I have a very old cast iron pot, or skillet rather, that also comes from the cottage, and which I use. I mean, it lives on my stovetop because we use it so much.
This has been a lovely session. Thank you all for being here. It's been great. So I would like to thank, on behalf of Julia Armstrong and the Culinary Historians of Canada, I'd like to thank Daphna, Simon, and Jennifer. Yay, yay, yay. Thank you. Thank you for being here. In the meantime, please stay well, please stay strong, and happy cooking.